Monica. Thanks for being with me today.
Hi, thanks for having me, Stephanie.
Could you start by introducing yourself and saying a little about where you're standing or where you're coming from?
Sure. My name's Monika Dutt. I'm a public health and family doctor. I have lived on Unama'ki in Sydney River for 14 years. I live here with my 14-year-old son, have been very involved with different community organizations. I don't know if it's most relevant to this discussion, but one of them being the Cabot Trail Writers Festival. Yeah, and just very much care about health in a very holistic way from, the biomedical to how we make better communities to support people's overall health and well-being.
Yeah, I think you and I probably intersect most through that Cabot Trail Writers Festival part of your life. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
When you look at the proposed provincial budget and the kinds of changes and cuts that are in there, when you look at that through your lens as a healthcare provider and somebody who's interested in like the health and well-being of communities, what is top of mind for you? What are you paying attention to in there?
It hit me first very much because of the festival. I had just finished our last AGM. I had stepped down as co-chair of the board. I'd been on the board for 5 years. We were, optimistic and excited. It was like literally just a few weeks ago that we had that. And then I first learned about the cuts through the artistic and executive director, Rebecca Silver Slater, who sent an email to, current board members, but then also because I had just been so involved, let us all know. And so that was my first understanding that, oh my goodness, something really significant is happening. So thinking about first how that really impacted one organization and then learning and reading and realizing how much it impacted, of course, arts, culture, and tourism across the board, and then many other, from caregivers to, scholarships for students to, my son coming home saying his African Nova Scotian support worker let the kids know that, scholarships will be likely not available. So it just kind of one by one, and then actually looking at the list of all the impacted organizations, it really seemed to me a list of organizations and grants and supports that when you think about the many different community organizations that contribute to health in all kinds of different ways, they were being impacted. So that was my immediate reaction. I'm not involved in the, of course, day to day of, how much money is there, how much do we have to spend. But when you look at that list, I think that's what really stood out to me. And very quickly, people started speaking to how they were being impacted. So yeah, especially in, I work in healthcare and public health, and we think about, who we might not be serving. And it's often because of things we're doing. We're not reaching out to people, we're not supporting people, we're not accessible to people. And with this budget, thinking about, the groups that probably are most both needing the support, but then also like deserve that support, either because historically they might not have gotten that support or because they're valuable parts of our communities that we want to strengthen. So those were some of my immediate thoughts.
Yeah, I've been really interested in, and I always come back to in these conversations, the kind of like this web of programs and supports and services that's currently in place across Nova Scotia and that serves all kinds of Nova Scotians, and I would argue probably touches the life of most, if not all, Nova Scotians. And in some ways, that web can be invisible to people until it's threatened. And I always come back to the two programs that I was so shocked to see cut to zero, which are artists in communities and artists in the schools. And so every school kid in Nova Scotia has had the benefit of there being artists in their schools. And while that might be like, oh, cool, we met a writer today, or we did this like music thing or this theater thing, the kid might experience that as just a cool moment where they were out of the usual, whatever happens at school.
Mhm.
But I know as an artist and as a programmer that there's something much deeper going on when a kid or when anybody gets to interact and engage with art. And I wonder, if you can talk about like the role that some of these kinds of programs do play in health and well-being, like really being able to connect those dots, because of course the healthcare system is important and it'll take every dollar we can give it. Um, but it's not the only part of ensuring health and well-being for Nova Scotians, right? There are these other kind of community efforts that are part of that picture, right?
Yeah, and when I tend to look with a health lens, and health can be defined in many different ways. But thinking about some of the, say, programming for youth and children in particular, and again, I had some direct involvement with the Writers in the Schools program through the Writers Festival, and especially living in a place where many communities are smaller, more rural, may not have access to a lot of things that may be available in bigger cities, which even a lot of that has been impacted now. But at a time when we want youth to be creative, not on screens, developing relationships, developing negotiation skills, critical thinking skills, ability to give feedback, all of those types of things come through with arts programs. And I know there's been kind of discussion around the arts that are available in school, but there is something about community-based arts programs, whether they're coming into schools or in the community, that connects youth and adults and seniors in a way to their community that may not happen in school-based programs, which are also essential and can also do those things depending on how they're designed. But I think there is something particularly vital around those community-based programs, and there is lots of evidence around that too, that added piece of being, in community with other people, maybe people you might not normally interact with, or your peers, that you can develop those skills. And I've been in contact quite a bit with the Arts and Health Antigonish group, and they've have wonderful feedback and stories and evaluations from people who have agreed to share their stories, and just respecting that they have given very um, you know personal details about how the arts programs have impacted their health. But whether it's they have an improv program with newcomers and people who have come from, very traumatic experiences, how much that has helped their mental health, their ability to interact with their kids, their families, their communities, or, some school-based programs with youth who, may meet all the checklists for, at risk, or however you want to define them, but in the end come through a process where they work with a singer-songwriter, and by the end they're able to achieve things that they never thought they could have before. Like it does go beyond something in the, well, I won't compare it to something in the classroom. I think they have you know they're wonderful in their own ways. But yeah, just speaking to how special that piece is, and it's essential. The whole culture is critical. It's not something that we should think of as something that's optional or extra that we can cut, because I think that also comes from this separation of art from other parts of our lives. This may be a bit of a digression, but my son got a letter home from school for choosing his courses for high school. And there was a line that said, arts subjects, and then in brackets said, for children who find science and math difficult, something along those lines. And
Hmm.
it just astounded me. And the school very quickly changed it once I spoke to it. But I think it kind of exemplified this separation that we think, the important things are these subjects and the extra things are arts, whereas it wasn't their intention. I think that was the impact, but they're integrated. My undergrad was a liberal arts degree, which I think was, I've useful degrees. Medicine is very useful, but my yeah, that degree is probably the one that made me think the most. And yeah, so that takes me away from your original question, but just the importance in our communities of arts, I think, can't be understated.
It does it was a great answer to that question, because it's leading me, and like there are a bunch of other things I want to ask you about that. And one of the things I'm thinking, there are a couple of things I'm thinking about. One is um what makes doctors want to, choose a community to live in, to have their life in. What are the kinds of things that doctors want to find in a new community that they're going to make their home.
You know, I can I almost feel like what makes anybody want to come to a community. So doctors are one group, but anyone who comes to a place and feels like this feels like home, which is essentially, I had no connection in Nova Scotia 14 years ago. I came here to work for 2 weeks. Within those 2 weeks, I went to actually a lot of musical events, and I was so astounded by what I was seeing. I had a, young child who was very excited. Like that just made me feel like this is a place I want to live. And so whether it's physicians or nurses or teachers or I don't know, mechanics. There was a story on CBC the other day. We need more mechanics, anyone who wants to come to a community. I think it's those pieces in addition to, of course, you want healthcare. Of course, you want a good education system. All of those pieces need to be there, but you want to feel like it's a place that really draws you into if you can. I know it's sometimes also a privilege to be able to choose where you work and what job you do and what, city you live in. But if you do have that ability, yeah, I think that environment around you is what really might be the factors that really say this is a place I want to stay. And you meet people that way. It's a way to get to know a community in a way that you wouldn't if you just go in, go to your office, meet people there, leave. Yeah, so it was a huge factor for me, and I don't think I told you that beforehand. And within
Did
2 weeks, I said I actually bought a house after 2 weeks,
you
and
did?
I did. And then I said I'd like the job. And then they said, wait a second, like we haven't posted the job yet. But yes, I was very just within weeks felt like this is where I want to be.
Oh, I love that. Because I feel like always in this kind of budget process, one of the mechanisms a government can use is to try to divide and conquer and to say it's either healthcare or arts. And I mean, I would make the case that it's those two things can't be divided. And even if you're only talking about attracting medical personnel to the province, which we do need to do, if you're only talking about attracting doctors and nurses, we have to think about what kinds of communities those doctors and nurses want to choose to live in. And so much of, if we go back to artists in the schools and artists in communities, so many of the programs that were funded by those envelopes did the kind of programming that was like March break and summer camps or after school programming that's arts related for kids. And so in some ways, like, anybody who is coming into communities here and has children and has a full-time job, they're going to need places, good
Mhm.
places for their kids to go. Um, and have great experiences while their parents are at work. So thinking about it in that way too, or from that kind of point of view of like, how do we make these whole communities that are appealing to all of us to live in, but in particular to healthcare professionals who are trying to recruit to the province to live in.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you were saying around kind of health and how it's often equated with healthcare. And I am such a supporter of publicly funded healthcare. And if we can get ER wait times down and more access to primary care, that is 100% fantastic goals. And I think more and more, we're thinking of health much more broadly than that. So for people who are looking for a place to come, yes, you want to make sure that the healthcare system is sufficient to meet those needs. But I think it can actually, well, I was thinking about how, there's various studies to look at how much healthcare contributes to overall health. And it's sometimes surprising this percentages can vary, but sometimes around 25% of your health is connected to access to healthcare. And 75%, this is a Canadian Medical Association, a stat that they put out and use often. And so that 75% that make people feel like this is a place that I feel healthy and I can thrive and I want to be. I think that is really important, that sense of belonging, the sense of feeling satisfied. Everyone would want to have those feelings and also recognizing, yeah, we also live in a province with a lot of poverty and a lot of barriers to even getting to that, very basic level of, having a few dollars to be able to, go pay to see a show or, having things that are accessible to everybody, I think makes it a better community for everyone, whether it's a healthcare professional choosing what community they want to go to, or, someone in the community, especially if you might not have access to those those types of events and activities in other ways. That's where these community organizations often that's why they exist, because there's a gap and they need to fill that gap.
Yeah, that idea that like true accessibility is actually it's lifting all the boats. You know, it's not just for the people who quote unquote need that access, but when things are more accessible, they're more accessible for every member of society, and it's a better society overall. I think another tack that politicians often take is again, it's that same divide and conquer of trying to create or emphasize in groups and out groups. You know, why should you get that when I don't have this? But that's a that's a constructed, well, it's a construct. It's
Mhm.
not necessarily connected to how we could actually be living, you know?
Yeah, and I think kind of putting kind of arts and culture and healthcare as opposing, it does add to those divisions that we could have one but not the other. When what if it was like, I don't know, the Department of Arts and Health? We could think of things differently. We do need to like, at some point organize different ways of doing things. But yeah, I agree. I think whether it's, say in the labor market by having, creating some of the divisions now we see with between people who may live in a place and newcomers to a place, and there's limited housing, which is a created problem by years of, say, not building sufficient housing. But then what it plays out as is people resenting other groups and people because they might not then be able to access something that we should all have access to. And yeah, similar with this budget, it was interesting because it affected so many groups that um, it had me thinking about a process we do in health and public health sometimes called an equity analysis. Because, like you were saying, there's intended and unintended consequences, but you want to try to at least think through what could the unintended consequences be, the things we don't think about. So it's just an idea that if you're putting in place a policy or program, try to think about what the impacts are, especially in groups that may traditionally have been discriminated against, may not have had access to resources. Ideally, have those people in the room because you might not think about them because you're not part of those groups. And then think about those impacts. If you can mitigate them, have them be less or change what you're doing, you've at least thought it through. And if you still go ahead, you go ahead saying, look, we know this will happen. And this is, what we're going to do to try to lessen this blow. But yeah, with this process, because it was such a blanket cut across so many different programs, it's hard to know, did that happen? Because I can't imagine that there weren't some programs that you could say, wow, look at all the fantastic things out of this program. Maybe there were others. You could say, okay, maybe this funding will be decreased slightly. But that didn't happen. It was also very sudden change for organizations that had budgeted for the, upcoming at least year, if not longer, and had planned on that funding.
Yes, so many organizations were in signed agreements with the province for multi-year, well, as Cabot Trail was, as afterwards Literary Festival is, and so
Yeah.
many other organizations were in agreed upon multi-year funding setups.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I was thinking about, some of the other directions that are in this budget, and these are directions toward an economy that is more built around um, energy extraction, uranium mining, fracking, that sort of thing. Uh, and I'm just curious, as a person who works in the health field, um, what, if anything, are you thinking about how we are treating the environment in Nova Scotia in this budget? Like, if you look with your healthcare lens at an economy that might move more toward extraction, what comes to mind for you there? What do you want Nova Scotians to be like thinking about or paying attention to as we consider whether that's a place to grow our economy?
Yeah, I guess I'd say, we know, things like climate change are real and impacting us now with fires and floods and, impacts on housing and people's lives. We know that, access to green spaces are essential for people's health. So I think again, it's thinking through, what are the policy decisions being made and what are the impacts on health, and environment is part of our health also. And I think also considering, maybe impacts that might not be here, but could be other places. So if we are, extracting certain goods, and I hate to even say the word goods, like this is land that that we are on. Yeah, what impact does it have on our land, our people, our health here, as well as, wherever that may be used later on. If it is, for example, fossil fuels, there is a broader impact. Of course, we need money to be able to do things. I think there's different ways that, others who think about this much more than me have talked about, from, different ways of taxing, especially, people like me and others who may have a higher income who could pay higher taxes. There have been discussions about things that have been decreased in the past that were revenue generators that, could have been ways that we could fund some of the things that are now being cut. So, recognizing it's a hard economy right now. There's lots of challenges. People are making decisions on all kinds of really important topics, but I do think considering impact on land, environment, people, health, there was a moratorium on fracking for many years because of some of the assessments that pointed to potential health and environmental impacts. So that was a recommendation at that point. And, I think many of those points are still valid.
Can you talk a little bit about the kind of like the specifics of how protective engaging with the arts can be for different kinds of people and different ways of accessing health, I guess?
Yeah, it's something that there's actually a lot of evidence around, and I've been reading actually quite a bit in the last, especially few weeks, just to, reacquaint myself with it. There's World Health Organization documents, there's all kinds of different studies that have been done. But just to pick a few examples, when you look at mental health, we know that music, visual arts can help with depression, can help with anxiety, things like for dementia, Alzheimer's, having activities that are arts-based can be really helpful for addressing some of those symptoms, keeping people connected, because often isolation is such a significant part of some of these conditions. Thinking about, mobility and cardiovascular health, things like dance and movement-based arts are really, really vital. And I think we've seen evidence both in terms of, say, formal art therapy that people do in clinics and hospitals and are vital there, but then also these community-based activities. I think you had, I can't believe I'm on after, an Oscar winner. I feel uh, inadequate beside that, but talking about, Inverness Arts or Inverness and some of the programs there around kind of art or yoga or others that, bring people out. These are, especially again in smaller rural communities, I think are really, really essential. And then the social connection and belonging that come from these. So we know that it helps reduce isolation and increase sense of belonging. Those are all really important parts of our health, because even if you have other medical conditions, if all of these other pieces are at least somewhat addressed, it helps you to deal with those medical conditions also. So I think, those are just some of the many, many ways in which arts and, arts in a very broad sense can very concretely impact our health.
I mean, that's basically what Tamara Deverell was saying too.
Mhm.
So I feel
Yeah.
like you are right on that level with that Oscar winner.
Yes.
In practical terms, like is part of the protective nature of like you mentioned a few times that feeling of being connected, right? Like people coming out and being connected. So is part of that just the psychological or like the whole life benefit of connection? And is part of it also that perhaps you're isolated otherwise, but now you're connecting with somebody who might notice something that's going on with you that's connected to your health and might kind of help shape that, your next approach? Like, oh, I notice you're, nice to see you, I see you every week, this week you're limping a little or your eye is doing this thing. Like, is that an aspect too of the value of these kinds of programs, like just on that basic practical a human noticing you level?
Yeah, and I think I focus on those types of activities because that's the nature of much of what the community organizations that are impacted by the cuts would be doing. So also, there is value in people who are writing and painting and drawing and doing, songwriting, all the things that you do individually, even if you don't share it more broadly later on. But yes, I think that that is a really big part of it. You're forming these connections. Whenever there's a disaster in Nova Scotia, we talk about how much communities come together at those times. How do those connections get made? There is something that needs to happen beforehand for people to care about each other. Then they can step in when something like that happens. So I think at the very individual level, yes, like if someone notices that, Betty hasn't been at the program for 3 weeks, is she doing okay? I should probably check in with her. Or, someone's improving in some way and you have that, validation and encouragement from someone that sees you regularly. I think those are really important parts of what makes, especially group activities, such an important part to health, both, noticing that individual changes, but also creating that community.
Before I let you go, one thing I'm thinking a lot about for myself in all of this, and that I've really liked hearing from other people about, is just, can you talk about how you're relating to hope right now?
I feel like usually my way to do that is through organizing with other people, whatever it is. I have a friend and I can't remember the exact slogan, but, action feels better than something really sad. I forget the word, but yeah, if you're doing something, especially if you're doing it in community with other people, that I think gives hope. Some of the discussions and advocacy and excitement that has come in the last few weeks. I think communities that might not have come together, people that might not have come together has been, great to see, hopefully with good outcomes. But I think I've been involved in, a number of different causes that, often don't get the outcome that you may want. But yeah, that coming together, that movement building, I think is really essential. And especially seeing how some young people have gotten really energized through all of this too. I think we all care about the communities that we live in. And I think it's come through so clearly, especially in the last month and, hopefully to continue on.
Monika, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for doing this, Stephanie.